Thank you, Shir Hever, for giving us your time. I'm just going to say a few words about you. Uh, or maybe I can leave it to you. You can present yourself. It's maybe better.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah.
My name is Shir Hever. I'm an Israeli economist. I live in Germany now, a political economist, and I study the various aspects of the Israeli occupation in Palestine, the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, and I've just written a book about the Israeli military industry and the security industry, and it's called The Privatization of Israeli Security.
This year is, as we all know, the 70th years of the so-called Al-Nakba. And we have all seen the horrific pictures of what's going on in Gaza borders. More than 60 persons has been killed, among them infant baby and people in wheelchairs, more than 1,400 injured, many of them crippled for life. The whole world, with the exception of some, is protesting against Israel. So I guess the question is why? Why would Israel and Netanyahu be willing to pay this price by damaging its already poor image on the international scene?
The Nakba is not the so-called Nakba. The Nakba is a very important and real historical event for the Palestinians. And every Palestinian around the world remembers the year in which Palestinians became a nation of refugees. Most Palestinians in the world today are refugees, or the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the refugees. In the last few weeks, from March 30 and until yesterday, which was the day of the Nakba, there were constant protests in Gaza of people who demand the right of return, which is part of their rights according to the international law, according to the United Nations, and also protesting the siege on the Gaza Strip. And I'm afraid I have to correct you, not 60 people were killed, but 110 people were killed over those few weeks. But 60 people were killed just on Monday, on the day in which the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem. There were a lot of protests, and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu celebrated in Jerusalem the opening of the United States new embassy, while Palestinians were being killed in Gaza. And now to answer your question, why would Israel do this? I think what we see now in Israel is not something unusual for a colonial society. Israel, like many other colonial societies, is going through changes over generations. And what we see is that the older generation, which is now retired and many of them have already passed away, they had a much more intelligent and much more logical way of controlling Palestinians and controlling the territory, caring a lot about what would be the international perspective on their policies, and trying to find ways to divide between Palestinian factions, to give Palestinians an incentive to work with the Israelis and to avoid rebelling against the Israeli occupation. But the younger generation of Israelis is now very different. And like I said, this is not unusual. This is not because something is strange about Israelis or about Jews. It's just about how colonial societies work. And the next generation has grown up, people of my age. We grew up being told by our education system that we deserve to control this land, that we are better, that this is a Jewish state where we are first-class citizens and everybody else are maybe less important. And because of that attitude, Israelis feel humiliated when they have to consider what are the repercussions of their actions towards Palestinians. Whenever they have to consider that, when they kill Palestinian civilians, when the Israeli army kills Palestinian civilians, this has repercussions, and there is international pressure, and the international media is covering it. it creates the impression that Palestinians are also human beings and they have equal rights and they demand to be treated with dignity. And if you live in a colonial society, you cannot accept it. It makes you feel less valuable if you have to respect the other person. And I think what we see now is a lot of young Israeli soldiers deployed on the border of Gaza, choosing to use lethal weapons and to use lethal violence against Palestinians, even though their officers and even though the generals have not given them the order to kill civilians, but they also don't dare to give them the opposite order and tell them to stop. Because if they tell them to stop, and to avoid shooting at civilians, they might have a rebellion within the military. And this is a sign that things are getting out of control.
Okay. Just let me first say that obviously I didn't mean to diminish the value of the Nakba when I said the so-called. The reason is actually that I said the so-called is because I was thinking of Ilan Pape's discussion about it, that catastrophe is not a correct word because it's a passive word. He uses the word a criminal act. So obviously I think you are right that it's a real thing and it's one of the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. We hear these days a lot about Hamas and by the extension, maybe even the Iranian government being the real orchestrator of these march among people from Gaza. How they use seemingly peaceful demonstrations to infiltrate Israel and send the terrorists into Israel. Or we hear about the clashes between Hamas and Israeli soldiers. Tell us first of all, who are the organizers of the Great March of Return? What is Hamas's role in this? And maybe you could tell us where we are witnessing whether we are witnessing a revival of the secular sections of the Palestinian movement.
Okay, well, of course, the information that we have on this is somewhat contradictory. I have been following it as closely as I can and listening to many different reports. The main thing that I see is that these protests in Gaza were organized by a committee of about 20 people from many different organizations and factions and groups and political parties. They decided to have a non-violent march protesting and demanding rights. Now, this is not the first time that it happens. There was a group like this in 2007, and they wanted to organize a great march of non-violent people, unarmed, walking towards the checkpoint and demanding the right to leave Gaza, to break through the siege. The Israeli army in 2007 was in a state of panic. They didn't know how to stop this kind of demonstration. And they tried to devise various tactics and strategies on how to do that. In the end, they didn't have to, because it was the Hamas party that stopped the march in 2007. The Hamas party is a party with a very clear message to the Palestinian people. They're saying, we are alone in the world. We cannot hope that the rest of the world will stand with solidarity with us and help us get our rights. So our only way to be free is to fight for our freedom ourselves. And the only way for us to do it is with weapons. And this is a statement that I am hoping very much is wrong. I'm doing everything that I can as a political activist to make the Hamas wrong. Yeah. That they cannot just get their freedom with weapons. There are other ways as well. Yeah. And this is, I think, what the March of Return is about. So actually, for the Hamas party, this is a threat to their political message. Yeah. If the March of Return is successful in breaking the siege, after Hamas have tried for decades to fight against the Israeli occupation with weapons and failed, then who needs Hamas anymore? Yeah. I think Hamas are very worried about it. Yeah. But because the Great March of Return is so popular, because so many Palestinians support it, they couldn't stop it this time. Yeah. This time they understood that they have to to support it, at least give it lip service of support, and they also gave a little bit of logistics support for it. From the Israeli side, however, the constant propaganda statement from the Israeli government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it was pumped to all of the embassies in Israel, the Israeli embassies around the world, and to many interviews on various international media channels, to repeat the message. It is Hamas. Hamas is organizing the demonstrations. Hamas is using demonstrations to sneak terrorists into Israel. Well, nobody has managed to sneak through into Israel. If there was a tactic for Hamas, it was very unsuccessful, and I don't think Hamas are stupid, and I don't think they would attempt something so ineffective like this. It's very clearly a lie, which the Israeli government is repeating again and again in order to justify killing civilians, because this way they can try to claim these are not civilians, these are members of a political party which they consider to be a political party only of terrorists. And talking about the people who were killed on Monday, 60 people. The Israeli government then said, we know that 25% of these people killed on Monday are members of the Hamas party. Now, of course, that doesn't justify killing them. I don't think that somebody's political views make that person deserving of a death penalty, even if I don't agree with their political views. However, the Israeli government didn't explain what about the other 35 that they killed. Are they also members of the Hamas party? Also, a baby, 8 months old, that was killed by the Israeli forces, is she also a member of Hamas? A girl that was 15 years old, a boy that was 14 years old. So we can see that this is just an excuse. It's not about Hamas. You also asked me whether there is a revival of the secular parts of Palestinian society. I think the attempt to try to create a kind of distinction as if there is a secular and a religious part of society is a very Western concept. And Palestinian society and also Israeli society, they don't really conform to this division of secular versus religious. People have their own ways to express their faith in many ways, openly or not openly, and they also have their political views, and sometimes they are more connected to each other and sometimes less. But there is no cultural or political concept of separation of church and state like you have in France, for example. This is just not part of the society in this part of the world. And I don't think that we can talk about revival of the secular parts of Palestinian society. Maybe we can talk about the revival of democratic elements in Palestinian society, and that is very strong. And it's very clear also that we see now a very large movement among Palestinians, also the organizers of the March of Return, who are saying, let's put aside all of the discussions about one state, two states, borders or not borders. Let's talk about human rights. Let's talk about civil rights. Let's talk about collective rights. And focusing on the discourse of rights. And of course, it also includes the right for free religious practice, that anyone can worship whoever they want to worship in any way they want. This is a democratic movement. I wouldn't call it secular.
Okay. Next question is more concerning for us as Iranians, or not only as Iranians, but as part of the Middle East, with all its shared history, its shared cultures, and so on. So the question is, do you think that the people of Middle East have a shared interest in the struggle for Palestinian rights? I'm asking this because during December, when there was some protests in Iran, during the 10 days, both Netanyahu and Trump, all of a sudden, they became great supporters of the Iranian people's cause. Obviously, I don't believe in Netanyahu's concern for the Iranian people. But what do you think? Are there any shared, do we as people in Middle East share something? I mean, people separated from governments. And how should we proceed within different nations to support each other?
Well, first of all, I would say that the interest in liberating the Palestinian people is, of course, not just the interest of Palestinians. It's the interest of everyone in the world, not specifically people in the Middle East. Some of the biggest and most determined solidarity movements with Palestinian rights are, for example, in Latin America. And they also see a direct relation between the rights of Palestinians and their rights, and they're not wrong. They understand that Israel-Palestine is a place where imperialist policies are being tested, new weapons are being developed, policies of apartheid are being expanded, and after they are used in Israel-Palestine, they are also then used in many other places of the world. And at the other side of this coin is that every victory of the Palestinian people is something that inspires people who fight for freedom all over the world, not just Palestinians. Now, your idea of this common goal of the people of the Middle East, this brings us, of course, to the era of decolonization. After the Second World War, when there was a wave of decolonizing the Middle East and new states were being founded, these states, these very young states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, saw Israel as a colonial leftover, some kind of representation of the colonial powers that was left behind in order to divide the Middle East and to control the center, exactly the connecting point between Africa and Asia, and between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And there is a lot of truth to that. That is the reason, I think, that these countries then made an effort to attack Israel and to try to destroy it. But this is not the end of the story. The story has continued for the last 70 years. The state of Israel would never have survived for 70 years if it is just surrounded by a hostile Middle East of countries that want to destroy it. It survives because it also has allies. It survives because there are a lot of divisions between the different countries in the Middle East. And right now, we see a lot of cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia, for example. There are different factions in Syria that are supported by Israel. And Jordan has been a quiet ally of Israel for many decades. This is a much more complex story than this. I think that one very important role that Israel plays in the Middle East is to represent American interests, the interests of the United States. You mentioned Donald Trump. Israel is the biggest recipient of military aid from the United States in the world. But all of these weapons that are sent to Israel from the United States, they're not just a present from the good nature and the kindness of the American people. They come because of interests. Yeah. And the United States wants Israel to use these weapons in certain ways. Of course, the people of the Middle East have a united interest. And here I talk about Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrians. They all have an interest that these weapons will get out of the Middle East. And all of these wars in the Middle East will stop. And the United States will stop playing different factions against each other in the Middle East in order to manipulate the price of oil and manipulate the price of weapons and so on. So in that sense, yes, I completely agree. And the way, of course, to make Israel no longer useful for the United States as a representative of U.S. interests in the region is to turn it into a democracy, is to make it represent the desire of the people who live there, and that includes the Palestinians. If this happens, I think the United States will stop their military aid to Israel immediately. But I want to say one thing maybe about Iran, because this was the core of your question. Yeah. The relations between the State of Israel and Iran are very complex and very long. And in fact, we should not forget that during the time of the Shah, there was a very strong military alliance between Israel and Iran. And after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, this alliance did not immediately end. That's something that not a lot of people remember, that during the Iran-Iraq war, Israeli weapon companies continued to sell weapons to Iran while American companies were selling weapons to Iraq, thereby fueling two sides of the war. And even after this war ended, some Israeli companies continued to trade with Iran secretly. There were a few cases that were published in the media and some people were arrested, but these stories continue to come all the time. So, of course, Netanyahu is not a friend of the Iranian people. Netanyahu is a very populist politician, and he built his entire political career on attacking Iran and sowing fear among Israelis that Iran will soon develop nuclear weapons and immediately bomb Israel if they're not stopped. And of course, this, in order to make this claim, one has to ignore what we know about which countries in the Middle East already have nuclear weapons. But this issue is an issue that is very, very centered around Netanyahu and his close political supporters.
Yeah.
The overall public opinion in Israel is diverse on the issue of Iran.
Okay.
Not everyone in Israel wants war with Iran. Not everyone in Israel is willing to pay the price of a war that will take many casualties on both sides. And not many Israelis are so afraid that if one day Iran will somehow obtain nuclear weapons, then they will immediately use them to bomb Israel. So because of this, I think the situation is rather complex, and I think because of this, Netanyahu also hesitates a little bit. Back in 2014, when the Minister of Defense was Ehud Barak, sorry, that was 2012, when the Minister of Defense was Ehud Barak, the Netanyahu then, like he always does, said Iran is almost developing a nuclear weapon, we have to attack Iran now. And then Ehud Barak gave an interview on the Israeli radio, and he was asked, is it really going to happen? Is Israel really going to attack Iran? Ehud Barak said, we are considering it, and we have calculated that if we will have a war with Iran, we will only have 500 casualties. Only 500 Israelis will die. The reaction in Israel was very interesting. People in Israel said, what do you mean only 500? This is unacceptable. We are not willing to have 500 people die for your adventures and political ambitions. And with this kind of response, they decided to lay low and avoid attacking, which I think is a very good thing. And now, of course, the situation has changed so much that it's very difficult to say what is going to happen next. It has become much more internationalized. Russia is also involved. So it's very hard for me to predict. But at least from the Israeli side, I can say not all Israelis are so happy about the war with Iran.
Shir, thank you very much for your time. It was very enlightening. I hope we can in the future take your time again and continue these kind of discussions.
Thank you, Reza.
Thank you.